For 15 years, she was invisible, just a janitor mopping floors in a company she secretly owned. But when the ruthless CEO humiliated her one last time, she decided to take everything from him. This is the untold story of how a cleaning lady brought down a corrupt billionaire and took her rightful place at the top. Watch till the end to see how she outsmarted, exposed, and destroyed him. If you love stories of justice, revenge, and underdog victories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The Invisible Woman and the Secret She Kept. The Brighton Enterprises skyscraper gleamed in the early morning Chicago sun, its towering glass facade reflecting the city's bustling energy. Inside, the elite of corporate America, stockbrokers, executives, and high-powered attorneys, moved through the polished marble floors, their conversations laced with arrogance and self-importance. And then there was Linda Carter. At 48 years old, she was just another face in the crowd. Except she wasn't even that. She was invisible. Her navy blue janitor's uniform marked her as someone beneath notice, just another nameless figure who wiped down desks, emptied trash cans, and scrubbed the very floors those executives strutted over like they owned the world. She had been doing this for 15 years. 15 years of whispers behind her back. 15 years of condescending glances. 15 years of hearing the same joke. "Hey, you missed a spot." Linda never complained. She never fought back. She just worked, her mop moving in steady circles, her eyes down. But Linda Carter had a secret no one in Brighton Enterprises could have imagined. Not the executives, not the shareholders, and certainly not the company's powerful and ruthless CEO, Richard Barnes. The tyrant in the corner office. Richard Barnes was the kind of man who made Wall Street sharks look like goldfish. A self-made billionaire, he took over Brighton Enterprises with a smile and a knife behind his back. He cut jobs to inflate profits, manipulated the stock market with backroom deals, and shredded documents faster than any accountant could keep up. And the worst part? He enjoyed it. Richard saw himself as an untouchable king, walking through the halls of Brighton like he was Caesar himself, flicking his fingers, deciding who stayed and who got the axe. Too slow, too soft, too useless, he'd mutter about employees who had worked their entire lives for the company before firing them on a whim. The worst moment came on a Tuesday morning. The humiliation. Linda was in the lobby, pushing her cart, when Richard walked in, flanked by his usual pack of yes-men. They were laughing, probably about their latest scheme to squeeze the company for another $1 million. Someone had spilled hot coffee near the elevators, and before she could react, Richard pointed straight at her and snapped his fingers like she was a dog. "Clean it up, Grandma." The whole lobby fell silent. Then they laughed, a loud, cruel laugh that echoed through the grand hall, bouncing off the glass walls like some twisted symphony of humiliation. Linda stood there frozen, mop in hand, heart pounding. 15 years of swallowing her pride. 15 years of pretending she didn't hear the whispers, the snickers, the dismissive smirks. 15 years of being nothing to them. She felt her face burn, the rage crawling up her spine. But she did what she always did, kept her head down, wiped up the coffee, and walked away. Except this time. This time she wasn't walking away from humiliation. She was walking away to plan Richard Barnes's downfall. The secret she held 15 years ago, before she ever set foot in Brighton with a mop in her hand. Linda Carter was more than a janitor. Her uncle, James Whitmore, had been a legendary businessman, a quiet investor with a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of justice. He had built his fortune investing in companies like Brighton, long before Richard Barnes ever came along. When he passed away, he left Linda something no one knew about. Shares, not just a few, a controlling percentage. She could have cashed out, walked away, and lived comfortably for the rest of her life. But Linda had never cared about money. She wanted to know what kind of people ran the company her uncle had believed in. So she stayed, not as an executive, not as an investor, but as a janitor. She watched, she listened, she learned, and she saw everything. Richard Barnes shredding financial reports in his office late at night. The secret emails he thought no one would ever read. The layoffs that made no sense, except to those who profited from them. For 15 years, she gathered proof. For 15 years, she waited. For 15 years, she let them think she was nothing. But after that day in the lobby, after the coffee, the laughter, the humiliation, Linda knew the time for waiting was over. The first move in the game that night, Linda sat in her tiny apartment, staring at the stack of documents in front of her. Emails, reports, numbers that didn't add up. Everything she needed to end Richard Barnes once and for all. She picked up her phone and dialed the only person she knew could help, Tom Williams, a lawyer with a reputation for destroying corrupt CEOs. He answered on the second ring. "Linda, it's been years. What's going on?" She took a deep breath, gripping the papers in her hands. "Tom, it's time." Silence. Then a slow chuckle. "I was wondering when you'd finally say that." The game begins. The next morning, Linda pushed her mop cart through the offices like she always did. No one noticed her. No one suspected a thing. Richard Barnes didn't know it yet, but his empire was about to crumble. And the janitor he had humiliated, she was about to take everything from him. The game of deception begins. The next morning, nothing seemed different. Linda Carter still walked into Brighton Enterprises at 6 a.m. sharp, pushing her mop cart down the sleek hallways, her uniform smelling faintly of bleach. The executives still breezed past her without a second glance. Richard Barnes was still in his corner office, barking orders like he was untouchable. But something had changed. Linda wasn't just cleaning anymore. She was hunting. She had the evidence. The emails, the financial discrepancies, the reports Barnes had thought he had destroyed. But evidence alone wasn't enough. If she wanted to bring him down, she needed to play smart. That's why she had called Tom Williams. The War Council. Later that night, Linda met Tom in a dimly lit diner across town. Tom was the kind of lawyer who made Wall Street executives break into cold sweats. He had built his career on exposing corrupt CEOs, and he loved every second of it. He sipped his coffee, watching Linda as she slid a thick folder across the table. "This is everything I have," she said. "Layoffs that shouldn't have happened. Money moved where it shouldn't be. Emails proving Richard Barnes has been lying to the board for years." Tom flipped through the documents, a slow grin forming on his face. "Linda, this is enough to bury the guy." She nodded, but her fingers tapped against the coffee cup, restless. "It's not just about firing him, Tom. I want to make sure he never hurts anyone again." Tom leaned back, considering. "All right, then. We don't just expose him. We annihilate him." The first strike. The next step was getting the board of directors on their side. Brighton Enterprises had 12 board members, all handpicked by Richard Barnes over the years. They weren't loyal to the company. They were loyal to him. That had to change. Tom and Linda started planting seeds of doubt. Linda began slipping anonymous documents onto board members' desks. Emails showing illegal firings, manipulated stock prices, and hush money payments. Tom had a few well-placed leaks sent to financial journalists, hinting at irregularities in Brighton's accounting. Linda even recorded conversations, little snippets of Richard mocking the board, calling them a bunch of cowards who would sign off on anything if I threw them a bone. Within days, the boardroom was in turmoil. Whispers started, tension grew, and Richard Barnes had no idea who was behind it, but he was getting paranoid. The enemy grows suspicious by the end of the week. Richard Barnes felt it. Something was wrong. People were acting differently around him. His assistant hesitated before handing him reports. The board members weren't as quick to agree with him anymore. He caught employees staring when he walked past, whispering when they thought he wasn't looking. And then, the first bomb dropped. One morning, a news article appeared in the Chicago Business Times. Brighton Enterprises under scrutiny for financial misconduct. The article didn't name Barnes directly, but it didn't have to. The entire piece hinted at top executives engaging in fraud. Richard lost it. "Who leaked this?" he roared, slamming the newspaper onto his desk. His inner circle scrambled for answers. "Sir, we don't know, but there's been a lot of talk lately. Some of the board members are asking questions." That was exactly what Linda and Tom had wanted. The trap is set. The shareholders' meeting was in 1 week. That would be the moment Linda revealed everything. But something felt off. Linda had spent years watching Richard Barnes. He wasn't just cruel, he was calculating. And right now, he was cornered. Cornered men were dangerous. She knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. And she was right. The unexpected attack. 2 nights before the shareholders' meeting, Linda was working late, just like always. She was in Richard's office, pretending to wipe down his desk, while her phone quietly took pictures of documents in his drawer. Then, a noise. The door lock clicked. Someone was coming. Linda's heart stopped. She barely had time to shove the papers back before the door swung open. Richard Barnes walked in, and he wasn't alone. Behind him were 2 security guards. Linda kept her head down, pretending to wipe a spot on the desk. "Carter," Richard said. His voice was too smooth, too controlled. "Working late? Or looking for something?" Linda forced herself to stay calm. "Just doing my job, sir." Richard circled the desk, his eyes sharp, calculating. "You know, I've been hearing rumors. Someone's been sneaking around my office at night. Someone's been stirring up trouble." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tell me, Carter, do you believe in loyalty?" Linda's grip tightened on her mop handle. Then Richard smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. "Because if you're not loyal to me, things tend to go badly for people like that." Linda didn't flinch. She had spent 15 years being invisible to these people. They had no idea what she was capable of. So she met Richard's gaze, smiled just as coldly, and said, "Loyalty, sir? I believe in justice." For the first time in his life, Richard Barnes hesitated, and Linda knew she had won. The final countdown. Linda walked out of that office, her heart still pounding. Richard knew something was happening. He didn't have proof. Yet. But that meant one thing. He would fight back. And when Richard Barnes fought, he fought dirty. Linda didn't have much time. The shareholders' meeting was in 48 hours. And before that moment arrived, Richard Barnes would make his move. She just had to be ready. The battle for Brighton. The CEO strikes back. The final countdown had begun. The Brighton Enterprises shareholders' meeting was just 48 hours away. For Linda Carter, that meant 2 days until victory. For Richard Barnes, that meant 2 days to stop her. Linda had spent 15 years in the shadows, collecting evidence, waiting for this moment. She had the proof. She had the votes. She had a plan. But Richard Barnes was not the kind of man who went down quietly, and Linda was about to learn just how dangerous he could be. The first attack, a warning in the dark. It started the very next night. Linda had just left the office, her bags stuffed with the last set of documents she needed to finalize her case. She walked home like always. Same route, same quiet streets, same cold Chicago wind biting at her face. But this time, something felt wrong. She wasn't alone. At first, she thought it was her imagination, just nerves. But as she turned the corner toward her apartment, she heard the footsteps. Someone was following her. Linda kept walking, her pulse quickening. She glanced at the glass windows of a storefront, her own reflection staring back at her. And behind her, a man in a dark coat. He was too close. Linda didn't panic. Instead, she did what she had always done. She adapted. She suddenly stopped walking. The man froze, startled. Then she turned around and looked right at him. "Something I can help you with?" she asked, her voice steady. The man didn't answer. He hesitated for just a second, then turned and disappeared into the night. Linda's hands were shaking. Richard Barnes was watching her, and he wanted her to know it. The second attack, the setup. The next morning, Linda arrived at work early, but when she went to open her locker, it was already open. Her things had been rifled through. Her work shirt was ripped in half, and sitting neatly on the shelf was a single white envelope. She slowly picked it up, fingers trembling. She opened it. Inside was a printout of an email supposedly from her. It was fake, but if someone didn't look too closely, it looked real enough. In the email, Linda Carter appeared to be offering information to a rival company in exchange for money. It was a trap, and Richard was about to spring it. She didn't have to wait long. Minutes later, 2 security guards appeared at her side. "Ms. Carter, we need you to come with us." Linda said nothing. She simply nodded and followed them to the HR office. Inside, a serious-looking woman sat behind a desk, the fake email printed and waiting. Linda, she began, her tone icy. Can you explain this? Linda didn't blink. She leaned forward, smiled. Do you really think I'd be stupid enough to write something like that? The woman hesitated. Then Linda dropped her own evidence onto the desk. Surveillance footage of Richard Barnes shredding documents, emails with his signature on fraudulent financial reports. Proof that the email from Linda was a fabrication, edited by someone inside the company. Linda leaned back. Maybe we should be talking about who forged this instead. The woman's face went pale, and just like that, the setup fell apart. Linda walked out untouched, but she knew Richard wasn't done yet. The worst was yet to come. The final attack. The betrayal that night, Tom called her. His voice was tight. Linda, we have a problem. She sat up in bed. What is it? Tom hesitated. Then he said the words that made her blood turn to ice. One of the board members flipped. Linda's stomach dropped. They had just enough votes to remove Richard Barnes. She had counted on every single board member she had convinced. Now, one of them had been bought. Richard had gotten to someone, and if they lost that vote, he would survive. Linda felt her heartbeat in her ears. Who is it? She asked. Tom sighed. David Coleman. Linda clenched her fists. Coleman had been the first board member she approached. He had seemed genuinely outraged when he saw the evidence. He had promised her he was on her side. And now? Now he had betrayed her. The last night before war, Linda sat in her apartment, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. For the first time, she wasn't sure she could win. Richard was still CEO. He still had power. And now he had an ally in the boardroom. For the first time in 15 years, Linda felt doubt. What if she had waited too long? What if she had underestimated Richard? What if, after all this time, she still wasn't strong enough to beat him? Then, her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. She opened it. It was a picture of her from earlier that night, walking home. Then another message appeared. Walk away, Carter. You won't survive this fight. Linda stared at the words. Her fear turned to something else, something stronger, determination. She set down her phone, took a deep breath. Then she picked up her folder of evidence, and she made one last call. Tom, she said, her voice steady, forget Coleman. We get Barnes tomorrow, no matter what it takes. And for the first time since this had started, she knew she was going to win. Checkmate, the CEO's final fall. The day had come. The Brighton Enterprises shareholders meeting was set for 9 a.m. sharp. By 9:05 a.m., the war would begin. By 9:30 a.m., someone would walk out in victory, and by 9:35 a.m., someone else would be destroyed. Linda Carter stood in front of the grand corporate boardroom doors, taking a slow breath. This was it. 15 years of silence. 15 years of watching. 15 years of waiting for this moment. Richard Barnes thought he had bought his way out of this. He thought he had scared her. He thought he had already won. He was wrong. She wasn't just here to fight him. She was here to end him. 9 a.m. The boardroom battle begins. Linda pushed open the doors. Inside, the Brighton Board of Directors sat around the long glass conference table. 12 men and women in tailored suits, each holding the fate of the company in their hands. At the head of the table, Richard Barnes sat like a king on his throne. He looked at Linda and smirked. Oh, how cute, he said, leaning back. You brought your mop to a business meeting? The board members chuckled. Linda didn't blink. She walked straight to the head of the table and dropped a thick manila folder in front of them. I'm not here as a janitor, she said coldly. I'm here as the majority shareholder of Brighton Enterprises, and I'm here to fire you. The room went silent. The laughter stopped. For the first time, Richard's smirk faltered. Excuse me, he said. Linda flipped open the folder. She didn't waste time. Evidence of fraud. Emails proving Richard manipulated stock numbers. Records of illegal layoffs. Financial discrepancies that could lead to a federal investigation. One by one, she laid them out. Every page, a nail in Richard Barnes's corporate coffin. By the time she finished speaking, half the board looked ready to vomit. The other half? They were watching Richard, waiting to see how he would fight back. and Richard, to his credit, tried. "This is ridiculous," he spat, slamming his hand on the table. "You all know me. You know this company. This is nothing but a stunt from some glorified cleaning lady." But his voice was shaking. He was losing control. And Linda wasn't done. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. "You know, Richard, you should really be more careful about where you have your phone calls." She tapped the screen. And then, his own voice filled the room. "Squeeze the little people. They're nothing. Hell, if I had it my way, I'd fire half the damn staff and pocket the difference. They're disposable. Brighton is mine. I built this empire, and no one is taking it from me." Silence. Absolute, deafening silence. Richard's face turned red. "You can't do this!" he roared, standing up so fast his chair toppled over. Linda met his eyes. "Oh, I already did." She turned to the board. "You have two choices," she said. "Keep him, and we all watch this company collapse under federal investigations and lawsuits, or remove him and start fixing what he broke." A single voice spoke first. "Vote him out." Then another. "Agreed." And then, one by one, the board members raised their hands. They had the votes. Richard Barnes was finished. 9:30 a.m. The final defeat security was already waiting. As Richard stood frozen, two uniformed guards stepped into the boardroom. "Sir, you need to leave." For a second, he didn't move. Then, he snapped. "This isn't over," he shouted, knocking over his coffee mug. "You think this nobody can take me down? I built this company. I own this city." He turned to Linda, eyes wild. "You think you won?" he snarled. "You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." Linda just smiled. "Funny," she said. "That's exactly what you used to say to me, right before you made me clean up your coffee." She pointed to the door. "Now get out of my building." And for the first time in his life, Richard Barnes had no power. Security grabbed him by the arms. He fought. He shouted. But it was over. As he was dragged out of the boardroom, the last thing he saw was Linda Carter, sitting in his chair. She had won. 1 week later, the new Brighton Enterprises. The air felt different. Employees walked through the halls smiling for the first time in years. The cleaning crew, they had raises, better hours, health benefits. And in Linda's new office, the CEO's office, a single framed note sat on the desk. A note she had once found in the employee break room. It read, "We need better coffee." She smiled. She picked up her phone. "Hey, Miguel." "Yeah, it's Linda. Put in an order for a new espresso machine in the break room, would you?" She leaned back, looking out over the Chicago skyline. 15 years ago, she had walked into this building as an invisible woman. Now, she had rewritten the rules. And as for Richard Barnes, last she heard, he was selling used cars in a no-name town. And no one, not a single soul, missed him. The lessons we learn. Linda Carter was never supposed to win. She was just a janitor, just a nobody. But the truth is, nobody is ever just anything. The people in power, they aren't invincible. The underdogs, they aren't weak. And when the time is right, even the invisible can change the world.